Most of us would agree that cats and humans are quite different. We tend to see ourselves as more evolved, not just because of our ability to think abstractly, but because we've taken on the task of being moral. We believe we can distinguish right from wrong, good from evil. And more than that, we feel a responsibility to improve the world, to perfect who we are, to refine our raw instincts in the name of a higher ethical standard. We carry a burden that cats simply don't recognize. For them, there is no division between nature and ideal. There are no ethical dilemmas or demands for virtue. A cat doesn't ask itself whether it should be more altruistic, less aggressive, or more productive. It simply lives. It eats when it's hungry. It runs when it senses danger. It sleeps when it's tired. And rather than making it inferior, this might reveal a form of wisdom we've forgotten along the way. Our search for meaning has become so heavy that we've begun to treat life like a problem to be solved, a curriculum to complete, a constant moral test. Meanwhile, cats have no such concerns. They feel no need to justify their existence with grand ideas or theories about how the world should be. They don't believe that suffering will make them purer. They don't think they need to improve. And yet, they seem to be at peace. Perhaps we are so attached to the idea of being superior that we forget to ask ourselves, is this sense of superiority really good for us? Could it be that all this effort to become more than we are has actually pulled us further away from the serenity we've always been seeking? Because while we create codes and doctrines to try to save ourselves from ourselves, cats remain indifferent, complete in their simplicity, faithful to their own nature. This indifference isn't arrogance, nor is it ignorance. It's a way of being in the world without demanding that the world conform to our ideals. This is exactly where John Gray's provocation comes in, a British philosopher who dared to look more closely at cats than at humanity's sacred books. In his most thought-provoking work, he proposes a radical shift. What if, instead of teaching cats to live like us, we were humble enough to learn from them? Stay with me until the end, because I'll share 5 tips inspired by feline behavior for you. John Gray isn't a typical philosopher. Instead of seeking answers in the most celebrated traditions of Western thought, he turned his gaze toward a silent, furry being utterly indifferent to our existential anxieties, the cat. In Feline Philosophy, Cats and the Meaning of Life, he proposes something unexpected, that cats, in their apparent simplicity, offer a more honest form of wisdom than most philosophers have ever managed to express. But this feline wisdom isn't philosophy in the classical sense. It's almost the opposite. It's an anti-philosophy. While humans create elaborate systems to understand suffering, desire, morality, time, and death, cats live as if these questions simply don't make any sense. For them, there is no need for meaning. And it's precisely because of that they are not tormented by the lack of it. Gray isn't suggesting that we should literally live like cats. Instead, he invites the reader to a bold reflection. Could it be that our desire to understand and control everything is actually what traps us? Is our relentless search for purpose, coherence, and redemption in every detail of life the very thing that prevents us from living fully? For cats, life doesn't need to be explained. It only needs to be lived. They don't worry about building a legacy or making the world a fairer place. And their refusal to engage in the human drama might seem cold, but perhaps it is freedom. Freedom from having to justify oneself. Freedom from carrying the weight of unreachable ideals. Gray points out that unlike most thinkers, cats don't try to save humanity from itself. They don't write manifestos. They don't found religions. They don't lead revolutions. And perhaps because of this, they are closer to the peace we so desperately seek. Because they don't live to become something they are not. They live simply to be. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. This provocation becomes even clearer in a curious story that Gray shares in his book. A story that starkly reveals how absurd we can be when we try to impose our beliefs even on the instinctive nature of animals. A story that is, at the very least, eye-opening. Among the most provocative stories told by John Gray, one stands out for its subtle absurdity. He recounts the case of a philosopher who believed he had convinced his cat to adopt a vegetarian diet. Proud of his achievement, the man saw in this dietary change a confirmation that even an animal could be elevated to human morality. All it took was goodwill, persistence, and a little meat-free kibble. What he didn't know, or pretended not to see, was that the cat, quietly faithful to its nature, would leave the house every night to hunt. Rats, birds, small creatures. The owner's morality never touched the cat's instinct. And perhaps the most ironic part of this story isn't the failure of the experiment, but the fact that it was considered a success all the way to the end, simply because the cat accepted the food offered. There's something profoundly revealing about this. The story isn't about a vegetarian cat. It's about us. About how we project our ideas onto the world with such intensity that we stop seeing the obvious. We try to convert everything to our ethical code, even when it doesn't apply. We ignore biology, concrete reality, instinct, and we go on believing that morality can, and should, govern everything. This insistence on moralizing nature, on forcing the world to follow our rules, has something violent about it, even when it's coded in good intentions. It's as if we're saying that nothing is legitimate unless it passes through our rational filter, our standard of right and wrong. But what if the world isn't here to obey our ideas? What if living isn't about convincing, but about coexisting with what we don't understand and can't control? In this sense, cats hold up an uncomfortable mirror to us. They don't negotiate their essence. They don't pretend to be something they are not to fit in or be liked. Unlike us, they don't live trying to prove they are good. And maybe that's why they seem so at peace, while we remain restless, trapped within our own rules. This moral restlessness we carry, this constant need to justify, control, and define what is right, is precisely what Gray questions most strongly. Because contrary to what we believe, morality doesn't always set us free. Many times, it is what shackles us. We believe that morality is the foundation of civilization, that it protects us from chaos, guides our choices, and defines what it means to be human. But John Gray dismantles this idea with the precision of someone who observes the world through eyes untouched by idealism. To him, human morality is less a universal truth and more a fragile, unstable construction, shaped by fashions, desires, and fears disguised as virtue. What we call just today might be seen as abominable tomorrow, and what we condemn today might one day be celebrated. History is full of these reversals. Yet, we insist on treating morality as something absolute, as if there were only one correct way to live, to feel, to exist. But what if there isn't? Very often, what we call morality is nothing more than a sophisticated way of trying to control others. We use moral arguments to justify our feelings, anger, fear, rejection, and to demand from others what we wish we could see in ourselves. We hide selfishness behind ethical speeches and the will to power behind judgments about goodness. Cats don't get involved in this game. They don't spend their lives measuring other people's behavior, nor do they worry about being approved by some invisible code. They act according to how they feel, with a raw honesty we often mistake for coldness. But perhaps that indifference is a form of freedom. The freedom from needing to be right all the time. We, on the other hand, carry morality like armor, heavy, rigid, built to protect us from making mistakes. But instead of liberating us, it imprisons us in a constant internal war. What we should feel, what we should do, what we should be. And the more we try to be good, the further we seem to drift from peace. Because true goodness doesn't come from effort. It comes from alignment with our own nature, something that cats seem to master with astonishing ease. This naturalness, this lack of conflict between what one is and what one does, begins to reveal the true contrast between our restlessness and the cat's serenity. While we strive, day after day, to become better than we are, they simply are. And it is in that simplicity that a profound kind of wisdom lives. It's hard to imagine a cat trying to improve itself. They don't make goal lists, They don't attend spiritual retreats, and they don't worry about controlling their thoughts. They don't feel guilty for being what they are. They don't fight their impulses or try to become better versions of themselves. A cat doesn't feel inferior for not being more affectionate, nor does it try to suppress its laziness with promises of productivity. This might sound like indifference, and maybe it is, but it is a wise indifference, born from the absence of self-loathing. Unlike us, who often see ourselves as unfinished projects, they live as if there is nothing to fix. Not because they are perfect, but because they are not trapped by the ideal of perfection. They don't carry within themselves the idea that they must improve in order to deserve to live. We humans, on the other hand, almost always feel that something is missing. An achievement, a virtue, a recognition. We are constantly trying to be more conscious, more generous, more productive, more happy. And this pursuit, noble in appearance, often hides a subtle rejection of who we are right now. A refusal to accept our unadorned humanity. Living in an endless effort to become someone better might seem like a path of growth, but many times it is a path of escape. We run from sadness by trying to be more joyful. We run from anger by trying to be more compassionate. We run from fear by trying to be more courageous. But maybe true transformation doesn't come from the attempt to be different. It comes from the courage to be who we are, with all our shadows, with all our flaws. Cats don't run from themselves. They don't seek purification. They feel no need to please. They simply follow their nature, effortlessly and guiltlessly. And in doing so, they show us that full acceptance of oneself might be more revolutionary than any ideal of self-overcoming. And yet, even though they follow no ethical code, they demonstrate behaviors that surprise us. They care. They protect. They face danger when necessary. It's a kind of silent, instinctive ethics that needs no words or explanations. An ethics born from the body, from instinct, from life in its most real form. It's a mistake to think that cats are indifferent or cold simply because they don't live according to human standards of morality. They care for their kittens with silent dedication. They face threats with unexpected courage. And they know when it's time to retreat. But none of it is done to impress or to seek recognition. There is no vanity in what they do, nor is there guilt when they don't. There is only a seamless alignment between action and necessity. If a cat protects, it's because it feels it must. If it attacks, it's because it senses danger. If it runs away, it's because it knows that living is more important than winning. It doesn't torture itself over whether it should have been braver. It doesn't martyr itself for having chosen to hide. Its decisions aren't born from moral dilemmas, but from a kind of instinctive wisdom that we humans often lose by trying to rationalize everything. This natural ethics, one not taught in books or imposed by rules, may be truer to life than many human codes, because it isn't aimed at the ideal, but at the real. It doesn't demand heroism or exaggerated sacrifice. It simply cares for life as it is, fragile, fleeting, concrete. And in that care, there is a beauty that needs no theories to be perceived. While we drown in speeches about right and wrong, cats act with silent precision. No noise, no justification. And the most interesting part is that, often, they do what would be considered ethical without even caring about ethics. Perhaps because, unlike us, they are not trying to be good. They are simply whole. This wholeness, this way of living without being torn apart by 1,000 demands, reveals a form of wisdom that cannot be learned from masters or moralists. It is born from the freedom of being faithful to one's own nature. And it is precisely this fidelity that cats have preserved, even while living among us. Because, contrary to what we imagine, they have not been shaped by our presence. It is they who, with their subtle ways, ended up shaping ours. We often think that cats were domesticated by us, that we became their owners, their caretakers, their masters. But this idea starts to crumble when we look more closely at the relationship they have with us. Because, unlike other domesticated animals, cats do not obey commands, do not live to please, and do not seem to have forgotten who they are. They approached us out of convenience, and stayed because they chose to. According to John Gray, the domestication of cats wasn't submission, but a silent negotiation. They realized there was food, shelter, and safety near humans, and they accepted this arrangement, but without giving up their nature. They continued hunting, choosing when to give or deny affection, and maintaining an internal space no one has ever managed to invade. They live among us, but they do not belong to us, and in that sense, they may never have been truly domesticated. We, on the other hand, have been trained by them without realizing it. We learn to understand their signals, respect their boundaries, and wait for the moment when they decide to give us attention. We organize our routines to please them, adapt our homes for their comfort, and even interpret their silence as affection. We are not their masters. We are their servants. And most curiously, we do it with pleasure. This subtle inversion reveals much more than it seems. It shows that true power lies not in domination, but in remaining faithful to oneself, even when living in someone else's territory. The cat doesn't surrender its essence to be accepted, and precisely because of that, it is respected. We, in contrast, often lose ourselves in the attempt to be loved, and in that attempt, we end up giving away more than we should. They do not mold themselves to fit into our affections. We are the ones who expand our affections to accommodate their presence. And perhaps there is something profoundly dignified in this. A reminder that the most genuine kind of love doesn't demand transformation but space. A space that the cat has always known how to occupy with elegance, autonomy, and a silence full of meaning. And it is precisely in that silence where we find what fascinates us the most. The freedom to remain whole, even in solitude. While we crave companionship, approval, and belonging, cats walk the opposite path. They don't live worried about what others think, nor do they mold their behavior to fit into a group. They can spend days alone, in silence, and never feel less alive, less loved, or less important because of it. There is a serenity in how they drift away, as if knowing that another's presence is a choice, not a necessity. For us, solitude often feels like absence, a void that must be filled as quickly as possible. But for them, being alone is simply a natural state. There's no impulse to distract themselves, no need to fill silence with noise or to escape boredom with constant stimulation. Cats don't turn on the television. They don't update social media. They don't fear being alone with their own thoughts, perhaps because they are not trying to escape themselves all the time. This independence isn't disdain, it's instinctive maturity. It's as if they already know, innately, what we spend a lifetime trying to learn. That true freedom is born when we are at peace with our own company. They don't seek validation. They don't ask if they are enough. They don't need applause to exist. And by observing them, we feel a twinge of envy, not for their beauty, nor for their grace, but for the way they remain whole even when alone. How they inhabit their own bodies without discomfort. How they feel no guilt for not being constantly available. The freedom of cats doesn't lie in where they live, but in how they live within themselves. They carry an autonomy that doesn't depend on external circumstances, and maybe that's why they aren't easily manipulated, nor predictable, nor dependent. And that, for those who watch with attentive eyes, is deeply inspiring. But there is something even more intriguing. Because even with all that independence, even without history or ambition, cats live with a lightness that escapes our comprehension, as if they needed nothing beyond the present moment, as if they had no past to carry, no future to fear. Perhaps the secret lies exactly there. Cats have no narrative about themselves. They don't build personal myths. They don't keep telling and retelling their life story to justify their choices or to find meaning in their pain. They don't need to explain why they are the way they are. They don't seek logic in their suffering or purpose in every stage of life. They simply live, and that seems to be enough. We, on the other hand, are always narrating. I am this way because that happened. I need to go through this to grow. My suffering has a greater purpose. These stories we create about ourselves offer a kind of comfort, but they also imprison us. When the narrative breaks, we collapse with it. When life doesn't fit the plot we expected, we suffer. And often, the suffering doesn't come from what happened, but from the gap between reality and the story we told ourselves about it. Cats don't identify with a past. They don't cling to experiences to build an identity. A trauma doesn't turn into drama. An abandonment doesn't become an identity. They do not chase after a true self, hidden somewhere between the pains of yesterday and the dreams of tomorrow. There is only the now, lived wholly, without needing justification. Maybe that's why they seem so light. Not because they are immune to suffering, but because they don't drag it out longer than necessary. They don't turn it into a continuous burden, into a flag of who they are. They feel, they react, they rest, and they move on. This unsettles us because we are taught from an early age that life must have a storyline, a journey, a lesson. But what if it doesn't? What if true freedom lies in living without the obligation to explain everything? What if, like cats, we could simply exist and allow that to be enough? This absence of a personal narrative may seem empty at first glance, but maybe it's not emptiness. Maybe it's space. Space to breathe, to change course without guilt, to avoid being trapped by outdated versions of ourselves. And in that space, something rare and precious begins to emerge. The lightness of those who do not carry their own name as a burden. The human search for meaning rarely comes with lightness. We carry this need as if dragging a heavy load, an urgency to justify what we feel, to transform every suffering into a lesson, to find a greater reason to continue. To suffer, for us, is not enough. We must name the suffering, fit it into a narrative, extract from it a lesson, an identity, a mission. But maybe it's precisely this that imprisons us. When we turn pain into identity, we stop allowing it to leave. When we say, "I am this way because of what I suffered," we trap the pain within ourselves. It becomes part of our storyline, part of our emotional biography. And the more meaning we assign to that suffering, the deeper it roots itself. We no longer know who we are without it. Cats don't do this. They don't explain their pain. They don't try to make it useful. Nor do they carry it forward for long periods. A scratch, a fall, a rejection. All of it is lived in the moment it happens. And then it passes. They don't revisit their wounds, nor do they reconstruct the past with new interpretations. They live as if understanding, effortlessly, that pain is part of life, but it doesn't define it. This absence of rumination isn't ignorance, it's instinctive wisdom. While we cultivate stories to give meaning to what we've lost, they simply let go. Not through force, but because they do not carry the habit of clinging to suffering as proof of existence. Maybe that's why they seem so light. Not because they live without pain, but because they don't turn every pain into an eternal chapter. This difference becomes even clearer when we think about the very idea of happiness. Cats don't know what that is. They don't dream of states of bliss. They don't make plans to feel better. They don't live aiming to reach some emotional ideal. They don't seek happiness. And maybe that's exactly what makes them so serene. They live according to their nature. They hunt when they need to hunt, sleep when they are tired, seek warmth when they are cold, and walk away when something bothers them. There's no drama, no expectation. They don't compare today's life with yesterday's. They don't wonder if tomorrow will be better. They are, at every moment, completely present. And the present for them is enough. John Gray points out this fact with precision. Perhaps the secret of feline tranquility lies in the absence of pursuit. While we chase after an abstract concept, happiness, and suffer for not reaching it, they simply live. The simplicity of experience, without interpretations or demands, shapes the peace we so admire in them. And maybe this is the most uncomfortable and, at the same time, the most liberating provocation of the book. What if we are unhappy not because something is missing, but because there is too much expectation? What if true lightness lies precisely in not needing a name for what we feel when we are at peace? And maybe, if cats could leave us advice, which of course, they never would, It wouldn't come in the form of rigid rules or universal commandments. It would come as gentle suggestions, almost like silent provocations, offered in the same spirit with which they play with a loose string or stretch lazily in the sun. At the end of his book, John Gray shares 10 principles inspired by the lives of cats. Here are 5 of them, adapted for us humans. Number 1. Never try to persuade humans to be reasonable. Cats don't waste time trying to change others' minds. If something bothers them, they simply walk away. Maybe we should do the same. Save our energy and avoid unnecessary frustrations. Number 2. It's foolish to complain that you don't have enough time. Cats live in the present moment without worrying about the clock. Instead of lamenting the lack of time, maybe we should focus on how we use the time we have. Number 3. Don't search for meaning in suffering, and avoid clinging to pain. Cats don't turn pain into identity. They feel it, react, and move on. Maybe we should learn to let pain go when it no longer has anything to teach us. Number 4. Stop chasing happiness. Follow what interests you, and the rest will come. For cats, happiness isn't a goal, but a consequence of living according to their nature. Maybe we should focus less on chasing happiness and more on living authentically. Number 5. Respect your nature. Live with simplicity and coherence. Cats don't pretend to be what they're not. They live according to their essence, without worrying about pleasing others or fitting in. Maybe we should allow ourselves to be who we truly are, without masks or pretensions. These suggestions are not magical formulas, but invitations to reflection. Perhaps by observing the serenity of cats, we can find clues on how to live more lightly and authentically. If you enjoyed this content, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next video.